Sarah Chen was just another charter pilot flying passengers across the Pacific Northwest. Nobody knew her secret past. But when an emergency struck and F-35 stealth fighters scrambled to respond, military pilots recognized her name and revealed the shocking truth: she was Phantom, America's most legendary combat aviator. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Portland Regional Airport as Captain Sarah Chen completed her pre-flight inspection of the Beechcraft King Air 350, running her hands along the twin turboprop sleek fuselage with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. At 38 years old, she had the kind of quiet competence that passengers found reassuring, her movements deliberate but unhurried as she checked the control surfaces and examined the landing gear. The charter company's logo gleamed on the aircraft's tail, and Sarah's navy blue uniform with its simple captain stripes marked her as just another professional aviator in the civilian aviation world, nothing more remarkable than the dozens of other pilots who operated regional flights and charter services throughout the Pacific Northwest. Inside the small terminal, her passengers for the morning's charter flight to Boise were gathering near the departure gate, a mix of business executives and consultants who barely glanced at the woman who would be flying them across 3 states. They saw what everyone saw when they looked at Sarah Chen, a competent, professional civilian pilot who had probably earned her commercial license through one of the standard aviation programs, built her flight hours instructing students or flying cargo routes, and worked her way up to the relative comfort of charter operations. One passenger, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, asked her casually about the weather conditions, and Sarah replied with easy professionalism, mentioning the clear skies and favorable winds without any hint that she had once navigated combat missions through conditions that would have grounded most civilian operations entirely. Her colleague Marcus, another charter pilot who flew the company's smaller Cessna Citation, waved to her from across the terminal and called out a cheerful greeting about grabbing coffee after her return flight. He had worked with Sarah for 3 years and considered her a solid, reliable pilot who kept to herself but could be counted on to handle the mundane challenges of civilian aviation with calm efficiency. Marcus had once asked her where she learned to fly, and Sarah had given him the vague but believable story about flight school in California and building hours through various civilian jobs, a narrative that matched the carefully constructed background she had maintained since leaving military service 7 years ago. The passengers boarded the King Air with casual confidence, settling into the comfortable leather seats while Sarah completed her cockpit preparations, running through checklists with meticulous attention. The turboprop engine spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Sarah's voice came through the cabin speakers with the standard pre-flight announcement about flight time, cruising altitude, and weather conditions. She taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and advanced the throttles to takeoff power, feeling the King Air accelerate down the centerline before rotating smoothly into the morning sky. The climb was textbook perfect, the kind of takeoff that passengers barely noticed because it was so professionally executed. Sarah leveled off at 23,000 feet while engaging the autopilot and settling into the cruise phase of the flight. The morning was progressing exactly as planned, with clear skies stretching across the Cascade Range and Central Oregon high desert, the kind of perfect flying weather that made civilian aviation seem almost effortless. She monitored her instruments with practiced ease, making minor course corrections and communicating with air traffic control in the calm, measured tones that characterized routine operations. Her passengers were working on laptops or reading, completely confident in the ordinary civilian pilot who was delivering them safely to their destination, never imagining that the hands on the King Air's controls had once commanded one of the most sophisticated combat aircraft ever designed. But the routine morning was about to transform into something that would shatter every assumption about the unremarkable charter pilot flying a turboprop across the American West. Sarah's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission from Seattle Center, the air traffic controller's voice carrying an unusual edge of tension. The controller was issuing an emergency broadcast to all aircraft in the region, reporting an unidentified aircraft operating without clearance in restricted airspace near the Boardman bombing range, exhibiting flight characteristics that suggested possible hostile intent or catastrophic navigation failure. Sarah's mind processed the information with instant tactical awareness that had never fully left her despite years of civilian flying. her eyes scanning the horizon while her hands moved instinctively to check her aircraft's systems. The controller's subsequent transmissions painted an increasingly alarming picture as more details emerged about the unidentified aircraft, which was now confirmed to be a small twin-engine plane that had departed from an unknown location, was not responding to radio communications, and was flying erratically toward populated areas in a manner that triggered every security protocol designed to prevent another catastrophic attack. Sarah could hear the tension building in the controller's voice as military assets were being scrambled to intercept and assess the threat, and she found herself automatically calculating intercept vectors and tactical responses even as she maintained her own aircraft's course and reassured her increasingly nervous passengers. Then came the transmission that changed everything, a new voice on the emergency frequency with the crisp, authoritative tone that Sarah recognized instantly as military fighter communications. The voice identified itself as Viper 11, an F-35A Lightning II from the 142nd Fighter Wing out of Portland Air National Guard Base, now supersonic and closing on the unidentified aircraft with orders to establish visual identification and determine the nature of the threat. Sarah felt something shift in her chest at the mention of the F-35, memories flooding back unbidden of the aircraft she had once known more intimately than any civilian plane, the fifth-generation stealth fighter that represented the pinnacle of modern air superiority and the platform where she had spent the most intense and consequential years of her life. Viper 11 reported visual contact with the unidentified aircraft, describing it as a Piper Navajo with visible damage to its control surfaces and flying in a dangerously unstable manner that suggested either mechanical failure or pilot incapacitation. The F-35 pilot's voice remained calm but intense as he maneuvered his stealth fighter into formation with the struggling twin-engine plane, trying to establish visual signals with the pilot since radio communications remained unsuccessful. Sarah listened with professional detachment, but her mind was simultaneously running tactical calculations that came from a completely different world, analyzing the F-35 pilot's approach vectors and considering the limited options available. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Viper 11 reported that the Navajo appeared to have no conscious pilot at the controls, the cockpit visible through his advanced sensors but showing slumped figures that suggested medical emergency, while the aircraft continued its erratic flight path that would bring it directly over downtown Boise within minutes. Seattle Center was coordinating an emergency response, trying to clear airspace and prepare ground emergency services, but the uncontrolled aircraft presented an impossible problem with no good solutions. Then came the transmission that would expose everything Sarah had worked so hard to keep hidden, a routine query from military command to Seattle Center requesting confirmation of all aircraft currently operating in the vicinity of the emergency. The controller responded with a list of aircraft positions and identifications, and when he reached the Beechcraft King Air at 23,000 feet, he provided Sarah's aircraft registration number and the pilot's name from the filed flight plan. There was a brief pause in the military communications, and then a different voice came on the frequency, this one belonging to Viper 12, the second F-35 that had been scrambled as backup. The voice carried unmistakable disbelief, the pilot clearly struggling to maintain composure. Seattle Center, Viper 12, requesting confirmation on that last aircraft identification. Did you say Captain Sarah Chen is flying that King Air? The controller confirmed the information with slight confusion, and there was another pause before Viper 12's voice came back, now carrying shock and something approaching awe. Center, be advised, if that's the Sarah Chen I think it is, you have Phantom in your airspace. Repeat, Phantom is flying civilian charter at Angels 2-3. Sarah's hands tightened imperceptibly on the King Air's controls, her expression remaining neutral behind her sunglasses, but inside she felt the carefully constructed walls of her civilian life cracking apart at the mention of that call sign. Phantom had been her identity in a different world, a legend among F-35 pilots who spoke of her missions with the kind of reverence reserved for the very few aviators who had pushed the Lightning II to its absolute limits. She had walked away from that world 7 years ago for reasons that still haunted her quiet moments, choosing the anonymous piece of civilian aviation over the relentless intensity of elite stealth fighter operations, and she had believed her past was secure behind classification barriers. Viper 11's voice joined his wingman's, the tactical situation momentarily forgotten. Phantom. The Phantom. Sarah Chen who flew the Raven missions. The radio discipline was deteriorating as shock overtook training, and Sarah could hear the barely controlled excitement in these younger fighter pilots' voices as they processed the impossible information that someone they had only known as an almost mythical figure from classified briefings was apparently flying a civilian charter plane in their airspace. Her passengers were staring at her now with confused shock, unable to reconcile the ordinary charter pilot they had boarded with 20 minutes ago with whatever was unfolding on the radio. Sarah knew she could no longer remain silent, not when lives were at stake and her presence had been revealed in a way that was disrupting the military response to a genuine crisis. She keyed her microphone with the same decisiveness that had once commanded combat operations, her voice carrying a different quality now, the tone of someone who had led fighter pilots through situations where hesitation meant death. Viper flight, Phantom actual. Put the hero worship away and focus on your mission. You have an uncontrolled aircraft heading for populated areas and you're wasting time discussing ancient history. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable, the civilian charter pilot's pleasant professionalism replaced by the clipped authority of a combat aviator who expected instant obedience. Viper 11's response came back with renewed focus but also unmistakable respect. Phantom, Viper 11, copy that. Ma'am, situation is critical. Navajo pilot appears incapacitated, aircraft is on autopilot with failing systems, current trajectory puts it over downtown Boise in 8 minutes. We have authorization for defensive action if necessary, but command is requesting alternatives to shooting down a civilian aircraft over populated areas. Sarah's mind shifted fully into tactical mode, years of civilian flying falling away as she accessed the training and experience that had made her legendary, analyzing the situation with the comprehensive awareness that came from countless hours at the controls of the world's most advanced stealth fighter. She ran calculations that combined her intimate knowledge of F-35 capabilities with the current tactical scenario, considering options that most pilots would never contemplate because they required the kind of precision and risk tolerance that only came from operating at the absolute edge of an aircraft's performance envelope. She queried Viper Flight for detailed information on the Navajo's exact flight characteristics, engine status, and control surface damage, her questions revealing an understanding of tactical assessment that went far beyond civilian pilot training. Within seconds, Sarah had formulated a plan that was audacious enough to make the F-35 pilots pause when she outlined it. She proposed a coordinated maneuver where the Lightning IIs would use their sophisticated flight control systems and thrust vectoring capabilities to generate precisely calculated wake turbulence and pressure waves that could force the Navajo's nose down and alter its trajectory away from Boise, essentially using the stealth fighters as invisible hands to push the uncontrolled aircraft toward an unpopulated area. The technique was theoretical, discussed in advanced fighter tactics courses but never actually attempted because it required extraordinary precision in formation flying and intimate knowledge of both aircraft's aerodynamic characteristics. Viper 11's response carried both skepticism and dawning hope. Phantom, that maneuver is extremely dangerous and untested. Our tactical computers are showing less than 40% success probability. Sarah's response was immediate and carried the weight of experience these younger pilots couldn't match. Viper, I've used similar techniques in classified operations that you don't have clearance to know about. It works if you have the skill and the nerve. I'm talking you through it step by step. You follow my instructions exactly, no improvisation, no hesitation. Understand? The F-35 pilot's demeanor transformed completely, their earlier shock replaced by focused intensity as they found themselves being commanded by someone whose tactical expertise was apparently even more formidable than her legendary reputation had suggested. Sarah's voice took on the rhythm of combat operations as she walked the Lightning II pilots through the setup, directing their positioning relative to the Navajo with specific altitude, speed, and distance parameters that revealed her comprehensive understanding of the F-35's flight characteristics and aerodynamic signature. She directed Viper 11 into position ahead and slightly above the Navajo, talking him through the precise power settings and flight control inputs needed to generate the specific wake turbulence pattern that would create downward pressure on the smaller aircraft without causing structural damage. Her instructions revealed an almost supernatural understanding of fluid dynamics and aircraft interaction effects, the kind of knowledge that came from pushing the F-35 through maneuvers that existed at the bleeding edge of the aircraft's capabilities. She simultaneously directed Viper 1-2 to position on the Navajo's opposite quarter, creating a coordinated pressure envelope that would guide the uncontrolled aircraft's descent. The execution required split-second timing and absolute trust in Sarah's calculations. As she counted down the initiation sequence, her voice carried the same calm authority that had once guided combat missions through contested airspace. Viper 1-1, on my mark, reduce power to 73% and execute a 4-degree nose-up attitude change with a 2-second hold. Viper 1-2, you'll mirror the maneuver 6 seconds later on the opposite side. The pressure differential will push the Navajo's nose down approximately 12 degrees if I've calculated correctly. The F-35 pilots acknowledged with tight voices, and then Sarah gave the mark with the decisiveness of someone who had made life-and-death calls countless times before. Viper 1-1 executed the maneuver with precision, and for a heart-stopping moment, it appeared nothing was happening. Then the sensors showed the twin-engine aircraft's nose dropping, not drastically but enough to alter its trajectory exactly as Sarah had predicted, the invisible pressure wave from the F-35's wake acting like a giant hand pushing the smaller aircraft into a different flight path. Viper 1-2 executed his part of the sequence 6 seconds later, and the combined effect steered the Navajo away from its collision course with Boise, sending it instead toward the empty high desert terrain where an uncontrolled landing would harm nobody on the ground. But Sarah wasn't finished, her tactical mind already several steps ahead as she directed the Lightning IIs through additional pressure manipulations that further refined the Navajo's trajectory toward the most favorable crash site while simultaneously bleeding off its airspeed. She was essentially flying the uncontrolled aircraft remotely using the F-35s as her control surfaces, displaying a mastery of aerodynamics and tactical aviation that left everyone monitoring the frequency in awe. The Navajo touched down roughly but survivably in the desert terrain, the emergency response teams reaching it quickly enough to extract the pilot who had suffered a medical emergency but was alive. The outcome was as successful as anyone could have hoped for, and it had been achieved through a tactical aviation technique that would immediately be classified and studied because it demonstrated capabilities that expanded the Lightning II's mission profile in ways that had only been theoretical until this moment. Viper 1-1's voice came through with barely controlled emotion. "Phantom, that was the most incredible piece of flying I've ever seen, and you weren't even in the aircraft. How did you know that would work?" Sarah's response carried a hint of the weight she had carried for years. "Because I've done worse in worse conditions when failure wasn't an option." "You did good work, Viper Flight." The immediate aftermath left everyone grappling with the impossible fact that one of the most legendary stealth fighter pilots in modern military history had been flying charter passengers in a turboprop. Seattle Center's controller addressed Sarah directly, his voice carrying confusion. "King Air November 735 Quebec Charlie, was that really you coordinating that operation? Are you former military?" Sarah considered her response carefully, knowing that the exposure she had dreaded for 7 years was now complete. Seattle Center, affirmative. "I have prior military experience. Requesting clearance to continue to Boise as filed." But Viper 1-1 cut through with unmistakable pride. "All stations, Viper 1-1. Captain Sarah Chen is former United States Air Force, call sign Phantom. She was one of the original F-35A operational test pilots and flew classified combat missions that shaped how the Lightning II is employed today. She's credited with air-to-air victories in contested airspace and tactical innovations that are still classified. Finding out she's been flying civilian charter is like discovering a Formula One champion has been driving a school bus." The radio exploded with responses as the revelation rippled through the aviation community, commercial airline pilots expressing disbelief, military pilots struggling to understand why a legendary combat aviator had walked away, and controllers piecing together the impossible truth. Sarah maintained her composure, acknowledging clearance to continue to Boise and returning her attention to flying the King Air as if nothing extraordinary had happened, though she could feel the weight of decades of carefully maintained secrecy collapsing around her. The descent into Boise was textbook perfect, her landing precise in ways that suddenly made complete sense given her background. The passengers exited quickly, their earlier casual friendliness replaced by uncomfortable awareness. The businessman who had asked about the weather that morning paused at the aircraft door, stammered a thank you that carried undertones of bewilderment. Sarah acknowledged him with professional courtesy, but there was no pretending everything hadn't changed. Her phone began buzzing incessantly during the turnaround, messages flooding in from people she hadn't spoken to in years, former squadron members, military public affairs officers, and aviation reporters who smelled a major story. Sarah ignored them all, focusing on the return flight to Portland with an empty cabin. Marcus was waiting on the tarmac when she landed, his expression a mixture of shock and hurt. "Why didn't you tell me? We worked together for 3 years and you never mentioned you were a combat pilot who flew F-35s. Sarah met his eyes directly. "It wasn't about trust, Marcus. I left that world because I needed to leave it, and the only way to actually leave was to become someone different. I didn't lie to you about who I am now. I just didn't tell you about who I used to be, because that person wasn't supposed to exist anymore." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 black SUVs with military plates. Colonel James Morrison emerged from the first vehicle in full dress uniform, his expression carrying professional concern and personal respect. "Captain Chen, or perhaps I should say Major Chen, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Your identity exposure has created complications. Several foreign intelligence services now have confirmation, and there are elements within the defense community who believe this provides an opportunity to bring you back into military service." Sarah stood her ground. "Sir, with respect, my service ended 7 years ago by mutual agreement. What happened this morning was an emergency response to save civilian lives, not a demonstration that I'm ready to return to military operations. I'm a civilian pilot now, and I intend to remain one." Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Rodriguez emerged from the second vehicle, her flight suit indicating she had come directly from operations. "Major Chen, I'm Rodriguez, 142nd Fighter Wing Commander. Viper 11 and 12 are my pilots. I need you to come with us to the base, not because we're forcing you back into service, but because what you did this morning created a tactical innovation that needs to be properly documented before every F-35 pilot tries to replicate it without your level of skill. Come talk to them, explain the principles, and then make whatever decision you want about your future." Sarah found herself nodding despite her better judgment, recognizing that Rodriguez had identified the one argument that could overcome her resistance. She agreed to follow them to Portland Air National Guard Base, knowing even as she agreed that simply returning to civilian charter operations as if nothing had changed was vanishingly unlikely. The briefing room was filled with F-35 pilots when Sarah entered, the entire fighter wing assembled to hear from the legendary pilot whose call sign they had known only as myth. She explained the aerodynamic principles and tactical calculations that had made the rescue possible, her knowledge revealing depths that went far beyond standard training programs. The pilots absorbed every word with focused intensity, several taking notes that would transform how they approached their own flying. When the formal debrief concluded, Rodriguez dismissed the other pilots but asked Sarah to remain. Morrison stepped forward with gravity. "Major Chen, your demonstration has created what they're calling a critical capability gap. They're prepared to offer you a return to active duty with immediate assignment to the F-35 Weapons School as Chief Instructor for Advanced Tactics." The offer was everything Sarah had once dreamed of, but it was also everything she had deliberately walked away from. "Sir, I'm honored, but my answer is no. I left because I was becoming someone defined entirely by classified missions and a reputation that made normal life impossible. I've built a different life, and while it may seem mundane to F-35 pilots, it allows me to be human in ways that weren't possible when I was Phantom." Rodriguez intervened with a different approach. "Major, what if you worked with us as a civilian contractor, coming in periodically to conduct advanced tactics instruction without rejoining the military? You could maintain your civilian career and still pass on knowledge that could save pilots' lives." Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang with a call from the charter company owner. The conversation confirmed her fears. She was being placed on administrative leave while they consulted insurance and legal counsel about the complications her background created. Sarah ended the call with professional courtesy that masked her frustration. Rodriguez seemed to sense Sarah's emotional state. You're in an impossible position. You can't go back to anonymous civilian flying, your employer is likely to terminate you, and you need institutional protection. Take the contractor position, at least temporarily, while you figure out what comes next. Sarah found herself nodding slowly, accepting that Rodriguez's proposal represented the most viable path forward. "Colonel, I'll accept your contractor offer on a trial basis, with the understanding that this is temporary. I'll conduct one advanced tactics course and then we'll reassess." The following weeks brought the full reality of Sarah's exposure as her story spread through aviation and military communities, generating media attention she had spent 7 years avoiding. She declined all media requests and focused on preparing the advanced tactics course that represented her first official work as a contractor. The course brought Sarah back into military instruction with remembered intensity, working with carefully selected F-35 pilots being groomed for leadership. She taught them principles beyond standard tactics, sharing insights about the Lightning II's capabilities that came from pushing the aircraft to its absolute limits. The pilots absorbed her instruction with hunger, and Sarah felt satisfaction in doing work that genuinely mattered. Rodriguez observed Sarah's conflicted state and approached her after a particularly intense session. "Major, I can see you're struggling with whether you made the right choice. Are you running from military aviation because you don't want to do it, or because you think you're not supposed to want it after having chosen to leave?" The question forced Sarah to confront motivations she hadn't fully examined. Rodriguez continued, "Maybe you're creating a false choice, deciding you have to be entirely Phantom or entirely the civilian pilot, when maybe the truth is you're both. The contractor work gives you space to contribute without being owned by military service. Maybe that's the balance you need." Sarah considered Rodriguez's words, recognizing truth in them. Maybe accepting that Phantom existed in how she analyzed situations regardless of what she wore represented a path forward that honored both who she had been and who she wanted to become. The advanced tactics course concluded with recognition that Sarah had fundamentally transformed how the participating pilots understood their aircraft. Rodriguez offered an ongoing contractor position with clearly defined parameters, quarterly instruction periods allowing her to maintain civilian flying while contributing to military aviation education. Sarah accepted with more peace than she had felt since that morning. She also accepted a position with a small cargo operation based in Alaska, flying supplies to remote locations in demanding conditions. The work was unglamorous but satisfying. Her background was known but mattered less in communities where people judged you by whether you showed up when weather kept other pilots grounded. The balance wasn't perfect and the visibility she had never wanted remained permanent, but Sarah gradually made peace with the reality that Phantom and Sarah Chen were both authentic parts of who she was. She flew F-35s quarterly through simulator sessions and guest instructor flights, sharing expertise that shaped the next generation. And she flew cargo through Alaskan winters that tested skills in ways combat had prepared her for. Years passed and Sarah's story became part of fighter pilot culture, the legend of Phantom who left military service and whose extraordinary capabilities were revealed during an emergency that required exactly the skills she possessed. Young F-35 pilots entering the program now heard her name during their initial tactical briefings, studied maneuvers she had pioneered during classified operations, and watched carefully edited footage of her instructional sessions where she demonstrated principles that pushed the Lightning II beyond what most aviators believed possible. The tactical rescue over Oregon had been declassified enough to become a case study in advanced fighter employment, though the full details of Sarah's role and the specific techniques she had employed remained restricted to pilots with appropriate clearances. In the ready rooms of F-35 squadrons across the United States and allied nations, Phantom's call sign had achieved almost mythical status, the kind of reverence that fighter pilots reserved for the very few aviators who had genuinely transformed their profession rather than simply excelling within existing parameters. But what made Sarah's legend particularly powerful was the human dimension that her exposure had revealed, the fact that someone capable of operating at the absolute pinnacle of military aviation had chosen to walk away and had found the courage to build a different life even when it meant concealing extraordinary capabilities behind the mundane exterior of civilian operations. The quarterly instruction periods that Sarah conducted at various Air Force and Navy fighter wings became highly sought-after assignments for pilots selected to attend. She would arrive at each base quietly, often flying herself in whatever cargo plane she happened to be operating that month, and would spend intense weeks working with small groups of elite aviators who had been carefully chosen for their potential to absorb and employ the advanced concepts she taught. Her instruction went far beyond technical maneuvers and tactical procedures, delving into the psychological and cognitive aspects of operating at the edge of human capability where split-second decisions determined whether missions succeeded or failed and whether pilots lived or died. Sarah discovered that teaching these younger pilots provided satisfaction that was different from but equally meaningful as the satisfaction she had found in her own operational flying. She was shaping the future of tactical aviation in ways that would ripple through decades of operations, planting seeds of innovation that would grow and evolve as her students moved into leadership positions and passed the knowledge forward to subsequent generations. The work required her to remain current with F-35 developments and continuously expand her own understanding of the aircraft's evolving capabilities, which meant regular simulator sessions and occasional flights in the Lightning II that reminded her viscerally of why she had loved that aircraft despite the costs it had demanded. But equally important to Sarah's sense of wholeness was the cargo flying that occupied the majority of her time, the unglamorous work of delivering supplies to remote Alaskan communities that depended on aviation for their survival. Flying a loaded Cessna Caravan through mountain passes in winter storms, navigating by visual reference when GPS signals became unreliable, and landing on ice strips that required judgment and skill rather than automation, this flying connected her to the fundamental principles of aviation in ways that even F-35 operations didn't quite capture. The people in these remote villages knew her as Sarah, the cargo pilot who could be counted on to get through when weather grounded everyone else, and they treated her with the straightforward appreciation of people who valued competence without being overwhelmed by reputation or background. One particular incident 3 years after her exposure crystallized for Sarah how fully she had integrated the different aspects of her identity. She was flying supplies to a village called Anaktuvuk Pass in the Brooks Range during marginal weather conditions, the kind of flying that existed in the gray area between prudent caution and necessary risk, when she encountered an emergency that had nothing to do with her aircraft but everything to do with her capabilities. A medevac helicopter carrying a critically injured child from a hunting accident had encountered severe icing conditions and was forced to land on a frozen lake 30 miles from the nearest medical facility, the crew unable to continue flight in the dangerous weather that was steadily deteriorating. Sarah heard the distress call on the emergency frequency and immediately calculated that her Cessna Caravan, while not designed for medevac operations, could reach the stranded helicopter and potentially extract the patient if she was willing to attempt a landing on the frozen lake surface in conditions that violated every standard safety protocol. The decision required exactly the kind of risk assessment that had characterized her most challenging F-35 missions, weighing the probability of success against the consequences of failure while accepting that some situations demanded action despite uncertain odds. She diverted to the coordinates the helicopter crew provided, descended through deteriorating visibility, and executed an approach to the frozen lake that drew on every bit of her tactical flying experience to compensate for the lack of proper instruments and the marginal conditions. The landing was rough but successful, and Sarah coordinated with the helicopter crew to transfer the injured child and his mother into her aircraft, making rapid calculations about weight and balance while preparing for a takeoff that would push her heavily loaded caravan to its performance limits. The departure from the lake required her to use every foot of available ice surface and accept a climb angle that left almost no margin for error, but she flew the aircraft with the precision that came from years of operating at the edge of capability, coaxing maximum performance from an engine that was laboring in the cold dense air. She delivered the patient to Fairbanks where advanced medical care was available, and the child survived because Sarah had been willing to attempt something that other pilots would have considered too dangerous to try. The incident received regional news coverage that briefly reminded people of Sarah's military background, but what struck her as significant was how naturally she had drawn on capabilities from both worlds, the tactical decision-making and risk assessment from her F-35 experience combined with the practical bush flying skills she had developed during her cargo operations. She hadn't been thinking of herself as phantom or as civilian cargo pilot Sarah Chen during that emergency, she had simply been an aviator with a specific set of capabilities responding to a situation where those capabilities made a difference. The integration she had been working toward for years was becoming unconscious and natural rather than something she had to consciously navigate. Marcus, who had remained her friend despite the awkwardness of discovering her hidden past, commented during one of their occasional phone conversations that Sarah seemed more at peace with herself than she had been during their charter pilot days. "You know, I used to think you were running from something when you were flying with us," he said with the directness that characterized their friendship. "But now I think maybe you were just trying to figure out who you were when you weren't being defined by what you could do in a fighter jet. And it seems like you figured it out, found a way to be both the legend and the regular person without having to pretend either one isn't real." His observation was accurate, and Sarah appreciated that someone who had known her during the years when she was still struggling with the contradiction between her past and present could see the evolution that had occurred. She had stopped viewing Phantom and Sarah Chen as competing identities requiring her to choose between them, and had instead recognized that they were both authentic expressions of who she was in different contexts. The quarterly F-35 instruction wasn't a compromise or a concession to military pressure. It was meaningful work that she chose because it mattered and because she was uniquely qualified to do it. And the cargo flying wasn't an escape from her capabilities or a rejection of her past, it was equally meaningful work that connected her to different communities and allowed her to employ her skills in ways that served immediate human needs. The media attention that had initially felt overwhelming gradually subsided as her story became part of aviation history rather than breaking news, though she remained a figure of interest to aviation enthusiasts and military historians. She gave occasional interviews to responsible journalists who approached the subject with appropriate respect for classified information, and she participated in select aviation conferences where her presence could contribute to serious discussions about pilot training and tactical innovation. But she had learned to set boundaries that protected her privacy and allowed her to maintain the balance between public recognition of her achievements and personal space to live without constant scrutiny. Rodriguez, who had become something approaching a friend during their professional interactions, once asked Sarah whether she had any regrets about how things had unfolded after that morning when the F-35s revealed her identity. "Do you ever wish you had stayed completely hidden, kept flying charter flights without anyone knowing who you really were?" The question deserved honest consideration, and Sarah thought carefully before responding. "There are days when I miss the simplicity of being anonymous, of not having people recognize my name or treat me differently because of my background. But honestly, I think I was hiding from myself as much as from others during those charter pilot years. The exposure forced me to stop pretending that Phantom wasn't part of who I am, and that integration, even though it was painful, ultimately made me more whole rather than less." Now, sitting in the cockpit of her Cessna Caravan on a clear autumn morning, preparing to depart from a small village after delivering a week's worth of supplies, Sarah felt a contentment that had eluded her during the years when she was trying to be only one version of herself. The villagers waved as she started the engine, their friendliness uncomplicated by the knowledge that existed elsewhere about her military background. She would fly this cargo route for another week, then head south to conduct an F-35 tactics course at Naval Air Station Lemoore, moving between these different worlds with a fluidity that no longer felt like contradiction but rather like the natural expression of someone who contained multitudes. The morning that F-35s had revealed her identity during that catastrophic emergency had felt like the destruction of everything she had carefully constructed during 7 years of civilian life. But time and experience had shown her that what she thought was destruction had actually been revelation in the truest sense, not just revealing her identity to others, but revealing to herself that she didn't have to choose between the different parts of who she was. She could be the legendary stealth fighter pilot whose innovations shaped modern tactical aviation. She could be the bush pilot who delivered supplies to remote villages through challenging conditions. She could be the instructor who helped younger aviators understand what true excellence demanded. She could be all of these things because they were all authentic expressions of capabilities and values that defined her. As Sarah advanced the throttle and felt the caravan accelerate down the gravel strip, lifting smoothly into the crystalline Arctic air, she smiled with genuine peace. Phantom would always be part of her story, but so would Sarah Chen the cargo pilot, and so would all the other versions of herself that she continued to discover and develop. The F-35s had revealed who she really was, but what they revealed turned out to be more complex, more human, and ultimately more complete than the simple legend of a combat pilot who had walked away. They revealed a woman who had the courage to excel at the highest levels, the wisdom to recognize when excellence came at unsustainable cost, and the strength to build a life that honored all of who she was rather than sacrificing parts of herself to maintain a simpler but less authentic narrative. And in the end, that was the most legendary thing about her after all.